reading is from Peter, the first chapter. For we do not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. But we had been eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, saying, This is my Son, my beloved, for whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this voice come from heaven while we were with him on the holy mountain. So we have the prophetic message more fully confirmed. You will do well to be attentive to this as to the lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning stars rise in your hearts. For all of you must understand this, that no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation, because no prophecy ever came by human will, but men and women moved by the Holy Spirit who spoke from God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please stand for the gospel.
The gospel reading this morning is a reading from St. Matthew, the 17th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. And you may be seated. Well, I might be dating myself when I tell you this, but I think some of you probably can relate. When I was growing up, vacations were very rare. Family vacations were very rare in my family growing up as a child. We didn't go far from home. Maybe if we were well behaved on a long weekend, my mom and dad might have gathered us 5 kids into our Ford 500 station wagon and traveled to Lind, Minnesota. How many of you have ever been to Lind, Minnesota? Well, we didn't even make it to Lind. We just made it to the farm outside of Lind where my grandma used to live. Now my cousins live, my girl cousins. So that was our overnight vacation, was in Lind. But if we were really well behaved, then sometimes we would get to go to the big city of Marshall and stay overnight with Grandma and Grandma who lived there. But vacations were rare, and we weren't. Families just didn't go on vacations. I guess that tells you my gray hair. It really wasn't a thing back then. At least my friends around Lake Bend. Not many of us went on family vacations. But when I got just into high school, one summer my dad rented a 12-passenger van, and he took actually a whole week off from work, and we went on our very first family vacation. Living in Lake Bend. Now, guess where we went? South Dakota. We went to South Dakota. But we went to Rapid City. We got to Rapid City. We toured Rapid City in the Badlands and Mount Rushmore. And so so we had that experience of seeing the Black Hills for the very first time. Pretty small mountains, right? They call them low mountains, right? Outside of Rapid City, but they still, for us, growing up in Lake Benton, they seem to be huge, huge mountains. And so as we traveled to Rapid City, you know, we were probably in the back, us kids were in the back, probably fighting, and you know, and Dad would kind of get our attention with an excited voice, and he'd say, "Hey kids, look, there are mountains! Look at the mountains!" You know, and we look out the window, and we were just filled with awe, because that was the first time we ever saw those strange protrusions coming out of the prairie, right? They were mountains, and of course, mountains are majestic, aren't they? Mountains are just a sight to see. And then we lived in Montana, of course. On internship, I served my internship in Frenchtown, Montana, and then we spent 4 years in Missoula, Montana, where there weren't the low mountains, but there were the high mountains, right, surrounding the Missoula mountains of 5,000 feet up to 9,000 feet, and we were able to go on many hikes up those mountains. And I remember particularly Rattlesnakes Mountain, that highest point, 8,000 feet. Just offered great views and peaks of the Missoula Valley. And I remember hiking that trail with Emily's grandpa, who had just turned 80 years old. And he hiked to the top of that mountain. But that was nothing, because just 5 years later, he was jumping on airplanes, doing skydiving. But that trailhead was a strenuous hike, but it was gorgeous. It was worth it. At the top, things were just magnificent. You could see all across the valley. You could see all of the Rattlesnake Mountains. It had a great view of the Mission Mountains, the Swan Mountains, the Bitterroot, the Sapphire, the Garnet mountain ranges. It was gorgeous. And all of the pristine lakes around Missoula as well. And it was just, that was a gorgeous trip up the Rattlesnake Wilderness Mountain. So, how many of you have been up on top of a mountain? Hiking, climbing. The views are great from high above a mountain. Well, that is what we call a mountaintop experience, and that is what the disciples experienced on the day of Transfiguration, which is what today is called the Day of Transfiguration, named after this unusual experience that Peter, James, and John had atop a mountain. And if you're paying attention, you might notice that in the Gospels, important things always happen on top of mountains. Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, guess where? On top of a mountain. And after his resurrection, before Jesus ascended into heaven, he gathers his disciples again to teach them on top of a mountain. And today he takes 3 of his disciples with him on a mountain where he is transformed. Scripture says that he is transfigured before their eyes, which means, as Matthew describes it, his face began to shine and his clothes became dazzling white. That's the Transfiguration. It's possible that we really can't describe this scene on the mountain. This is the best that Matthew can give us, because it is such a terrifying experience for the disciples. It is such an awe-filled experience for the disciples. And I think that life is full of these moments. Life is full of these terrifying and these awe-filled moments. Moments where our patience becomes thin. Moments where sometimes our hope becomes thin. Sometimes moments where our grace and our love for becomes very thin, where our outlook in life, our outlook on the future becomes very narrow and thin, or when we feel like maybe even our life is thin. So I think we have these moments all the time. And certainly you have had these moments in your life as well. Those moments like just before and just after the birth of a baby. Those moments like just before and just after the death of a loved one. That moment just before and just after you realize that this relationship that you are currently in isn't working. Or that moment just before and just after that relationship you are in is working. And you find yourselves at an altar. And you're terrified. Or you're filled with awe. You are scared out of your mind. Or that moment where I know that many of you have been, when you're waiting in a room designated for waiting at the hospital before surgery begins, or as surgery is in process, or as surgery ends, and you're terrified and you're filled with fear. Or perhaps that moment when you're the one having the surgery yourself, and you're filled with fear. And in these moments, we need those times when we can touch the divine. In these moments, in these times, we need the divine to touch us. We need God to come to us in these moments where we are terrified, where we are filled with awe, where we are afraid. We need the divine to touch our fear, to touch our terror, even if it's just a moment, even if it's just for a second, to remind us, to remind you that the true love for us is in Jesus Christ. And this love absorbs some of that fear. That this love of Jesus Christ will absorb some of that terror that you are currently in, that you currently are feeling. That anxiety that is just filled the inside of you. That the love of Jesus absorbs that for us. And so in today's gospel, these disciples, these three disciples, need to know that as well. Peter, Andrew, and John need to know that because they are heading to a place that will be terrifying for them as well. They're heading not to a mountain, but they are heading to a little hill outside of Jerusalem where Jesus will suffer, where Jesus will die upon the cross. And in fact, you're heading there too. In fact, we're heading there too together. Because after this Sunday, we're heading into Lent, and we're beginning with Ash Wednesday, and we'll end at the cross on Good Friday. At the cross of suffering, the dark cross, where God shows up. Where God shows up. Because that's really what happened in the story that is before us today. God showed up. God showed up in all of that awe. God showed up in all of that terror. That is the story of the Transfiguration. That God actually comes and shows up. God showed up in Jesus in such a way that His presence was unmistakable to the three disciples who witnessed the event. God showed up and gave them a glimpse of the truth about who their friend Jesus really was. God showed up in the blinding light and in the thundering words. And it was a glimpse of glory that they would carry with them in those dark days to come that they had to face together. And it would be a story that they would tell for generations to come. It would be a story that they would tell for years and for generations. The story about the blinding light, the story about Moses, and the story about Elijah. And they would tell the story about the cloud and the voice that they heard from the cloud. This is my Son, the beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. So listen to him. Listen to this one. And then they would tell about the story of the mountain where they went with Jesus, not suspecting what they would see or hear there. But it's true, God showed up. God showed up in the mountain where they went with Jesus. God showed up. And God shows up in our lives when things seem terrible for us. And when things seem terrifying for us. God always shows up. This is the promise and this is the hope of the Transfiguration. That God shows up when we are in fear, when we are terrified, when we are in a dark place. God shows up. Because when we are in these times, we need something to walk by, and we need someone to walk with. And so God shows up. In these times of fear and in these times of terror, we need something to follow by. And we need someone to lead us so that we can know the truth. And so all of our personal tragedies, all of your personal tragedies, all the things that you have had to deal with in your life, and even the things that you're going to have to deal with in your life. A death of a loved one, a chronic illness, a time of deep doubt. We can continue to persevere in those times. We can even overcome in those times because we have the hope and we have the promise that God shows up in those times. That God shows up in those times in your life. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him, God says, because he is the lamp shining in the dark place. And God's word helps us to see that. This is God's Son. So listen to him. Follow him. Put your faith in him. Trust him.